relationships, and the quality of life. When thinking about what causes the best and the worst moods in life, chances are you would think of other people. A lover or spouse can make you feel wonderfully elated, but also irritated and depressed. Children can be a blessing or a pain. A word from the boss can make or break a day. Of all the things we normally do, interaction with others is the least predictable. At one moment, it is flow. The next, apathy, anxiety, relaxation, or boredom. Because of the power that interactions have on our mind, clinicians have developed forms of psychotherapy that depend on maximizing pleasant encounters with others. There is no doubt that well-being is deeply attuned to relationships, and that consciousness resonates to the feedback we receive from other people. For example, Sarah, one of the people we studied with the experience sampling method, at 9:10 on a Saturday morning, was sitting alone in her kitchen having breakfast and reading the paper. When the pager signaled, she rated her happiness 5 on a scale where 1 is sad and 7 very happy. When the next signal arrived at 11:30, she was still alone, smoking a cigarette, saddened by the thought that her son was about to move away to a different city. Now her happiness had fallen to a 3. At 1 in the afternoon, Sarah was alone, vacuuming the living room, happiness down to 1. By 2:30 p.m., she is in the backyard, swimming with the grandchildren. Happiness is a perfect 7. But less than an hour later, as she is taking the sun and trying to read a book while her grandchildren splash her with water, the happiness rating is down to 2 again. My daughter-in-law should take those brats in hand more, she writes on the ESM response sheet. As we move through the day, thinking about people and interacting with them play constant riffs on our moods. In most societies, people depend on the social context to an even greater extent than in the technological West. We believe that the individual should be left free to develop his or her potential, and at least since Rousseau, we have come to think of society as a pervasive obstacle to personal fulfillment. In contrast, the traditional view, especially in Asia, has been that the individual is nothing until shaped and refined through interaction with others. India provides one of the clearest examples of how this works. The classical Hindu culture has taken great pains to ensure that from infancy to old age, its members conform to appropriate ideals of behavior. The Hindu person is produced consciously and deliberately during a series of collective events. These events are samskaras, life cycle rituals that are fundamental and compulsory in the life of a Hindu, writes Lynn Hart. Samskaras help to shape children and adults by giving them new rules of conduct for each successive step in life. As the Indian psychoanalyst Sathir Kakar wrote half facetiously, samskaras are the right at the right time. He wrote, "The conceptualization of the human life cycle unfolding in a series of stages, with each stage having its unique tasks and the need for an orderly progression through the stages, is an established part of traditional Indian thought. One of the major thrusts of these rituals is the gradual integration of the child into society, with the samskaras, as it were, beating time to a measured movement that takes the child away from the original mother-infant symbiosis into the full-fledged membership of his community." But socialization not only shapes behavior, it also molds consciousness to the expectations and aspirations of the culture, so that we feel shame when others observe our failings, and guilt when we feel that we have let others down. Here, too, cultures differ enormously in terms of how deeply the self depends on internalized community expectations. For instance, the Japanese have several words to describe fine shadings of dependence, obligations, and responsibility that are difficult to translate into English because, in our social environment, we have not learned to experience such feelings to the same extent. In Japan, according to Shintaro Ryu, a perceptive Japanese journalist, the typical individual wants to go wherever others go. Even when he goes to the beach to swim, he avoids the uncrowded place, but chooses a spot where people are practically on top of one another. It is not difficult to see why we are so enmeshed in our social milieu, both mentally and physically. Even our primate relations, the apes that live in the African jungles and savannas, have learned that unless they are accepted by the group, they won't live long. A solitary baboon will soon fall prey to leopards or hyenas. Our ancestors realized a long time ago that they were social animals, that they depended on the group not only for protection, but also for learning the amenities of life. The Greek word idiot originally meant someone who lived by himself. It was assumed that, cut off from community interaction, such a person would be mentally incompetent. In contemporary pre-literate societies, this knowledge is so deeply ingrained that a person who likes to be alone is assumed to be a witch, for a normal person would not choose to leave the company of others unless forced to do so. Because interactions are so important for keeping consciousness in balance, it's important to understand how they affect us and to learn how to turn them into positive rather than negative experiences. As with everything else, one cannot enjoy relationships for free. One must expend a certain amount of psychic energy to reap their benefits. If we do not, we risk finding ourselves in the shoes of Sultra's character in No Exit, who concluded that hell was other people. A relationship that leads to order in consciousness instead of psychic entropy has to meet at least two conditions. The first is to find some compatibility between our goals and that of the other person or persons. This is always difficult in principle, given that each participant in the interaction is bound to pursue his or her self-interest. Nevertheless, in most situations, if one looks for it, one can discover at least a shred of shared goals. The second condition for a successful interaction is that one will be willing to invest attention in the other person's goals. Not an easy task either, considering that psychic energy is the most essential and scarce resource we own. When these conditions are met, it is possible to get the most valuable result from being with other people, to experience the flow that comes from optimal interaction. The most positive experiences people report are usually those with friends. This is especially true for adolescents, but it remains true also in the later years of life. People are generally much happier and more motivated when with friends, regardless of what they are doing. Even studying and household chores, which depress moods when done alone or with the family, become positive experiences when done with friends. It's not difficult to see why this should be the case. With friends, the conditions for an optimal interaction are usually maximized. We choose them because we see their goals as compatible with ours, and the relationship is one of equality. Friendships are expected to provide mutual benefits, with no external constraints that might lead to exploitation. Ideally, friendships are never static. They provide ever-new emotional and intellectual stimulation, so that the relationship does not fade into boredom or apathy. We try new things, activities, and adventures. We develop new attitudes, ideas, and values. We get to know friends more deeply and intimately. While many flow activities are enjoyable only in the short run, because their challenges are soon exhausted, friends offer potentially infinite stimulation throughout life, honing our emotional and intellectual skills. Of course, this ideal is not achieved very often. Instead of promoting growth, friendships often provide a safe cocoon where our self-image can be preserved without ever having to change. The superficial sociability of teenage peer groups, suburban clubs and coffee klatches, professional associations, drinking buddies, gives a soothing sense of being part of a like-minded set of people without demanding effort or growth. One indication of this trend is where we see that concentration is usually significantly lower with friends than in solitude. Apparently, mental effort is rarely involved in typical friendly interactions. In the worst cases, when a person without the other close ties comes to depend exclusively on other rootless individuals for emotional support, friendship can be destructive. Urban gangs, delinquent groups, and terrorist cells are usually made up of individuals who, either because of their own fault or because of circumstances, have not found a niche in any community, and have only each other to confirm their identities. In such cases, growth also happens as a result of the relationship, but from the point of view of the majority, it is a malignant growth. Compared to the other main features of the social environment, however, friendships offer both the most emotionally rewarding contexts in the immediate present and the greatest opportunities for developing one's potential in the long run. Contemporary life, however, is not very suitable for sustaining friendships. In more traditional societies, a person remains in contact throughout all of his or her life with the friends made in childhood. The geographical and social mobility in the United States makes this almost impossible. Our high school friends are not the same as those we made in grade school, and in college, friendships are reshuffled once more. Then one moves from one job to another, from one city to the next, and with age, transient friendships become ever more superficial. Lack of true friends is often the main complaint of people confronting an emotional crisis in the second half of life. Another frequent cause of complaint is the lack of rewarding sexual relationships. One of the cultural achievements of this century has been the rediscovery of the importance of good sex for a good life. However, as usual, the pendulum has swung too far. Sexuality has been decontextualized from the rest of experience, and people have accepted the erroneous notion that liberal doses of sex will make them happy. Variety and frequency of sexual encounters have taken precedence over the depth and intensity of the relationship in which they are embedded. It is ironic that on this issue the traditional teachings of the churches are closer to a scientific position than the up-to-date beliefs of the populace, for an evolutionary approach confirms that the original purpose of sexuality is making children and binding the parental couple. Of course, this doesn't mean that these functions need to be the only purpose of sex. For example, the adaptive function of taste buds was to distinguish between wholesome and spoiled food, but with time we developed complex culinary arts based on subtle nuances of taste. So, also, whatever were the original reasons for sexual pleasure, it can always be used to yield new possibilities for enriching life. But just as gluttony that has no relationship to hunger seems unnatural, an obsession with sex that is divorced from other human needs, such as intimacy, caring, and commitment, becomes equally aberrant. When the daring pioneers of instinctual liberation hailed free sex as the solution to the repression of society, they did not dwell on the possibility that, half a century later, sex would be used to sell deodorants and soft drinks. As Herbert Marcuse and others ruefully noted, Eros was bound to be exploited one way or another. Its energy was too strong for it not to be co-opted by the powers of church, state, or, if neither of these, then the advertising industry. In the past, sexuality was repressed so that the psychic energy attracted to it could be channeled into productive goals. Now, sexuality is encouraged so that people will channel their psychic energy into consumption that gives them the illusion of sexual fulfillment. In either case, a force that could result in some of the deepest and most intimate joys of life is taken over and manipulated by outside interests. What can one do? As with other aspects of life, the important thing is to decide for oneself, to realize what is at stake, and what are the interests that try to control our sexuality for their own ends. It helps to realize how vulnerable we are in this respect. It is a very universal condition. We were told in our part of the Rockies that coyotes sometimes send a female in heat to lure unsuspecting male farm dogs into the ambush of the pack. When realizing our vulnerability, the danger is falling into the opposite extreme and becoming paranoid about sex. Neither celibacy nor promiscuity are necessarily to our advantage. What counts is how we wish to order our lives, and what part we wish sexuality to play in it. In partial compensation for the difficulty of having friends, we have discovered in the United States a new possibility: be friends with parents, spouses, and children. In the European tradition of courtly love, friendship with one's husband or wife was considered an oxymoron. When marriages were largely at the service of economic or political alliances, and children depended on their parents for inheritance and status, the condition of equality and reciprocity that make friendships possible were lacking. In the last few generations, however, the family has lost most of its role as an economic necessity. And the less we depend on it for material benefits, the more we can enjoy its potential for emotional rewards. Thus, the modern family, with all its problems, opens up new possibilities for optimal experiences that were much more difficult to come by in previous times. In the last few decades, we have come to realize that the image of the family we have been cherishing since at least Victorian times is only one of many possible alternatives. According to the historian Leroy Ladurie, a rural French family in the late Middle Ages was made up by whoever lived under the same roof and shared the same meals. This might have included people actually related by blood, but also farmhands and other persons who strayed in to help with the farm work and were given shelter. Apparently no further distinction was made among these individuals. Whether related or not, they were seen to belong to the same domus, or house made of stone or mortar, which was the unit that really mattered, rather than the biological family. 1,000 years earlier, the Roman family was a very different social arrangement. Here, the patriarch had the legal right to kill his children if they displeased him, and biological descent mattered almost as much as it did later for the aristocratic families of the 19th century. And these variations were still within the same cultural tradition. In addition, anthropologists have made us familiar with a huge variety of other family forms, from the enormously extended Hawaiian family, where every woman of the older generation is considered to be one's mother, to various forms of polygamous and polyandrous arrangements, all of which has prepared us to see the dissolution of the nuclear family, with 50% divorce rates and the majority of children growing up in father-absent or reconstituted families, as not as much a tragedy as a normal transition to new forms adapted to changing social and economic conditions. At the extremes, we hear claims that the family is an obsolete, reactionary institution destined to disappear. An opposite view is proposed by conservatives who aim to uphold family values, meaning a return to the conventional patterns enshrined in mid-century television sitcoms. Who is right in this controversy? Clearly, both sides are right to some extent, and both are wrong in taking a rigid view of an evolving pattern. On the one hand, it is disingenuous to argue that an ideal family pattern ever existed, and that we can hold on to this chimera while the rest of social conditions are changing. On the other hand, it is equally mistaken to argue that a healthy social system can exist without the emotional support and nurturance that parents alone seem to be able to give growing children. For no matter how much variety there is in the form families have taken, one constant has been that they included adults of the opposite sex who took on responsibilities for each other's welfare and for that of their offspring. It is for this reason that marriage is such a complex institution in all societies. The negotiations involved in it, which have included fine calculations of dowries and bride price, were intended to guarantee that children born of the union would not become a public burden. In all societies, parents and relatives of the bride and groom took on the responsibility of supporting and training the offspring of the union, both in terms of material needs and of socialization into community values and rules. So far, no society, not the Soviet Union, not Israel, not Communist China, has been able to finesse the family and substitute other social institutions in its stead. It is one of the great ironies of our times that, with all good intentions, liberal capitalism has succeeded in weakening families more than they ever had been before, without being able to invent a substitute for them. The effects of family relationships on the quality of life are so extensive that volumes could be written about it. In fact, many great works of literature, from Oedipus Rex to Hamlet, Madame Bovary to Desire Under the Elms, have it as their theme. Family interactions affect the quality of experience in different ways for each member. Fathers, mothers, and children will respond to the same event according to their perception of the situation and the history of past vicissitudes in their relationship. But to make a very broad generalization, the family acts as a flywheel for the emotional ups and downs of the day. Moods at home are rarely as elated as with friends, and rarely as low as when one is alone. At the same time, it is at home that one can release pent-up emotions with relative safety, as shown by the unfortunate abuse and violence that are a feature of dysfunctional families. In an extensive study of family dynamics with the experience sampling method, Reed Larson and Marcy Richards found several interesting patterns. For instance, when both parents are employed, husbands' moods are low at work, but improve when they get home, while the opposite is true for wives who have to face household chores when they return from the outside job, thus creating opposite cycles of emotional well-being. Contrary to what one would expect, there are more arguments in families that are emotionally close. When the family is in real trouble, parents and children avoid each other instead of arguing. Even in contemporary families, gender differences among the spouses are still strong. The moods of the father affect the moods of the rest of the family, and the children's moods affect the mother, but the mother's moods have little discernible effect on the rest of the family. Also, about 40% of the fathers and less than 10% of the mothers say that their teenager's achievement puts them in a good mood, whereas 45% of the mothers and only 20% of the fathers say that the teenagers being in a good mood improves their own. Clearly, men are still more concerned about what their children do, and women about how their children feel, as gender roles require. Much has been written about what makes families work. The consensus is that families that support the emotional well-being and growth of their members combine two almost opposite traits. They combine discipline with spontaneity, rules with freedom, high expectations with unstinting love. An optimal family system is complex in that it encourages the unique individual development of its members while uniting them in a web of effective ties. Rules and discipline are needed to avoid excessive waste of psychic energy in the negotiation of what can or cannot be done. When the children should come home, when to do homework, who is to wash the dishes. Then the psychic energy released from bickering and arguing can be invested in the pursuit of each member's goals. At the same time, each person knows that he or she can draw on the collective psychic energy of the family if needed. Growing up in a complex family, children have a chance to develop skills and recognize challenges, and thus are more prepared to experience life as flow. In our society, the average person spends about 1/3 of his or her waking time alone. Persons who spend much more or much less time by themselves often have problems. Teenagers who always hang out with peers have trouble in school and are unlikely to learn to think for themselves, while those who are always alone are easy prey to depression and alienation. Suicide is more frequent among people whose work isolates them physically, such as lumbermen in the North, or emotionally, like psychiatrists. The exceptions involve situations where the days are so strictly programmed that psychic entropy has no chance to take hold of consciousness. Chartreusian monks may spend most of their lives in their secluded cells without ill effects, or, at the other extreme of sociability, the same is true of submarine crews, where the sailors might never have any privacy for months on end. In many pre-literate societies, the optimal amount of solitude was 0. The Dobuans of Melanesia, described by the anthropologist Rio Fortuna, are typical in that they tried to avoid being alone like the plague. In Dobu, when people had to go into the bush to relieve themselves, they always went with a friend or relative, for fear of being harmed by witchcraft if they went alone. That sorcery is most effective against a lonely person is not an entirely fanciful idea. What it describes is a real fact, although its explanation is allegorical. It describes what many social scientists have noted, namely that the mind of a solitary individual is vulnerable to delusions and irrational fears. When we talk to another person, even about the most trivial subjects, such as the weather or last night's ball game, the conversation introduces a shared reality into our consciousness. Even a greeting such as, "Have a nice day," reassures us that we exist because other people notice us and are concerned about our welfare. Thus, the fundamental function of even the most routine encounters is reality maintenance, which is indispensable, lest consciousness disintegrates into chaos. In line with such reasons, people in general report much lower moods when alone than when they are with others. They feel less happy, less cheerful, less strong, and more bored, more passive, more lonely. The only dimension of experience that tends to be higher alone is concentration. When first hearing about these patterns, many thoughtful persons are incredulous. "This cannot be true," they say. "I love to be alone and seek out solitude when I can." In fact, it is possible to learn to like solitude, but it does not come easily. If one is an artist, scientist, or writer, or if one has a hobby or a rich inner life, then being alone is not only enjoyable but necessary. Relatively few individuals, however, master the mental tools that will make this possible. Most people also overestimate their ability to tolerate solitude. A survey conducted in Germany by Elizabeth Noel Neumann shows the amusing lengths to which we go to delude ourselves in this respect. She showed thousands of respondents 2 pictures of a mountain landscape. One picture featured a meadow crowded with hikers, the other the same scene but with only a few people. Then she asked 2 questions. The first was, in which of these 2 places would you prefer to spend your holidays? About 60% chose the deserted meadow and only 34% the crowded one. The second question was, in which of these 2 places do you think most Germans would prefer to spend their holidays? To this, 61% answered that the crowded scene would be their compatriots' first choice, and 23% the lonely one. Here, as in many similar situations, one can learn more about true preferences by listening to what people say others want, rather than to what they claim they want themselves. Whether we like solitude or not, however, in our times we must be able to put up with some of it. It's difficult to learn math or practice piano or program a computer or figure out the purpose of one's life when other people are around. The concentration required to order thoughts in consciousness is easily interrupted by an extraneous word, by the necessity to pay attention to another person. Thus, we find that adolescents who feel they must always be with friends, and these are usually youngsters whose families provide little emotional support, tend not to have the psychic energy needed for complex learning. Even with superior mental aptitude, the dread of solitude prevents them from developing their talents. If it is true that loneliness has been a constant threat to humankind, strangers have been no less of a problem. Generally, we assume that people who differ from us, by kinship, language, race, religion, education, and class, will have goals that cross purposes from ours, and therefore must be watched with suspicion. Early human groups usually assumed that they were the only true humans, and those who did not share their culture were not. Even though genetically we are all related, cultural differences have served to reinforce our isolation from each other. Because of this, whenever different groups have come into contact, they have been all too often able to ignore each other's humanity and treat the other as an enemy that, in case of need, could be destroyed without too much compunction. This is true not only of headhunters in New Guinea, but of Bosnian Serbs and Muslims, Irish Catholics and Protestants, and an infinity of other conflicts between races and creeds barely simmering under the surface of civilization. The first real melting pots of diverse tribal identities were the great cities that arose about 8,000 years ago in many different parts of the world. from China to India to Egypt. Here, for the first time, people from different backgrounds learn to cooperate and to tolerate foreign ways. But even the cosmopolitan metropolis has been unable to eliminate the fear of strangers. In medieval Paris, students as young as 7 years old had to wear daggers when they walked to and from the cathedral schools to defend themselves against kidnappers and thieves. Now students in the inner city wear guns. In the 17th century, it was extremely common for women walking the city streets to be raped by gangs of roaming youth. In the urban jungle, a man with a different skin color, different clothes, and demeanor is still a potential predator. In this case, too, however, there is another side to the coin. For while we are repelled by differences, we are also fascinated by the strange and the exotic. The metropolis is so attractive in part because the clash of cultures sets up an atmosphere of excitement, freedom, and creativity that is difficult to find in an isolated, homogeneous culture. As a result, people report some of their most positive experiences in public spaces where they are surrounded by strangers. Parks, streets, restaurants, theaters, clubs, and beaches. As long as we can presume that the others will share our basic goals and will behave predictably within certain limits, their presence adds a great deal of spice to the quality of life. The current push toward pluralism in a global culture, admittedly not the same thing, but both tending toward integration rather than differentiation, is one way to reduce the strangeness of strangers. Another is the restoration of communities. The air quotations around the word restoration in the previous sentence are there to indicate that ideal communities, like ideal families, may never have really existed. When reading histories of private lives, one is hard put to find any place at any time where people went about their business in serene cooperation, without fear of enemies from inside or outside the community. There might have been no racial minorities or organized crime in small Chinese, Indian, or European towns, but one found misfits, deviants, heretics, inferior castes, political or religious animosities that exploded in civil war, and so on. In the United States, the earliest communities must have had a great deal of cohesion, provided they were not split by witch hunts, Indian wars, conflicts between those for and against the British Crown, or for and against slavery. In other words, the ideal community that inspired Norman Rockwell's brushes was no more typical than his pink, well-fed families sitting with bowed heads and complacent smiles around the Thanksgiving dinner table. Nevertheless, this does not mean that trying to create wholesome communities is a bad idea. Rather, it suggests that instead of looking for models in the past, we should figure out what a safe yet stimulating social environment could be like in the future. From the beginnings of Western philosophy, thinkers have conceived of two main ways of fulfilling human potentials. The first involved the vita activa, or the expression of one's being through action in the public arena, meaning paying attention to what goes on in the social environment, making decisions, engaging in politics, arguing for one's convictions, taking a stand even at the cost of one's comfort and reputation. This is what some of the most influential Greek philosophers saw as the ultimate fulfillment of one's essence. Later, under the influence of Christian philosophy, the vita contemplativa gained ascendancy as the best way to spend one's life. It was through solitary reflection, prayer, communion with the Supreme Being, that one was thought to achieve the most complete fulfillment. And these two strategies were usually seen as mutually exclusive. One could not be a doer and a thinker at the same time. This dichotomy still pervades our understanding of human behavior. Carl Jung introduced the concepts of extroversion versus introversion as fundamental and opposite traits of the psyche. The sociologist David Reisman described a historical change from inner-directed to outer-directed personalities. In current psychological research, extroversion and introversion are considered the most stable personality traits that differentiate people from each other, and that can be realistically measured. Usually, each of us tends to be one or the other. Either loving to interact with people but feeling lost when alone, or finding delight in solitude but unable to relate to people. Which one of these types is the most likely to get the best out of life? Current studies provide consistent evidence that outgoing, extroverted people are happier, more cheerful, less stressed, more serene, more at peace with themselves than introverts. The conclusion seems to be that extroverts, who are thought to be born, not made, get a better deal in life all around. In this case, however, I have some reservations about how the data have been interpreted. One of the manifestations of extroversion is to put a positive spin on things, while introverts are more prone to be reserved in describing their inner states. So the quality of experience might be similar in both groups, and only the reporting differs. A better solution is suggested by the study of creative individuals. Instead of being either extroverts or introverts, such people seem to express both traits in the process of going about their lives. True, the stereotype of the solitary genius is strong and does have a basis in fact. After all, one must generally be alone in order to write, paint, or do experiments in a laboratory. Yet over and over again, creative individuals stress the importance of seeing people, hearing people, exchanging ideas, and getting to know another person's work. The physicist John Archibald Wheeler expresses this point with great directness. He says, "If you don't kick things around with people, you're out of it. Nobody, I always say, can be anybody without somebody being around." Another outstanding scientist, Freeman Dyson, expresses with a fine nuance the opposite phases of this dichotomy in his work. He points to the door of his office and says, "Science is a very gregarious business. It is essentially the difference between having this door open and having it shut. When I am doing science, I have the door open. You want to be, all the time, talking with people, because it is only by interacting with other people that you get anything interesting done. It is essentially a communal enterprise. There are new things happening all the time, and you should keep abreast and keep yourself aware of what is going on. You must be constantly talking. But of course, writing is different. When I am writing, I have the door shut. And even then, too much sound comes through. So very often, when I am writing, I go and hide in the library. It is a solitary game." John Reed, the CEO of Citicorp, who has led his company successfully through some turbulent times, has built the alternation between inner-directed reflection and intense social interaction into his daily routine. He told us, "I'm an early morning guy. I get up at 5, always, get out of the shower about 5:30, and I typically try to work either at home or at the office, and that's when I do a good bit of my thinking and priority setting. I try to keep a reasonably quiet time until 9:30 or 10. Then you get involved in lots of transactions. If you are chairman of the company, it's like being a tribal chieftain. People come into your office and talk to you." Even in the very private realm of the arts, the ability to interact is essential. The sculptor Nina Holton describes well the role of sociability in her work. She says, "You really can't work entirely alone in your place. You want to have a fellow artist come and talk things over with you. How does that strike you? You have to have some sort of feedback. You can't be sitting there entirely by yourself. And eventually, when you begin to show, you have to have a whole network. You have to get to know gallery people. You have to get to know people who work in your field who are involved. And you may want to find out whether you wish to be part of it or not be part of it. But you cannot help being part of a fellowship, The way these creative individuals confront life suggests that it is possible to be both extroverted and introverted at the same time. In fact, expressing the full range from inner to outer directedness might be the normal way of being human. What is abnormal is to get boxed in at one of the ends of this continuum and experience life only as a gregarious or only as a solitary being. Certainly temperament and socialization will push us in one or the other direction, and after a while it becomes easy to fall in with these conditioning forces and learn to relish either social interaction or solitude, but not both. To do so, however, curtails the full range of what humans can experience and diminishes the possibilities of enjoyment in life.